Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story, the stranger appeared on a stretch of mountain road where nobody should have been walking that late. It was shortly after 11 on an October night in 2018, and the nearest town was almost 20 miles behind the car. Harold Bennett had been driving through eastern Kentucky for more than 3 hours when his headlights caught a man standing beside the guardrail. There was no house nearby, no parked vehicle, and no obvious trail leading into the forest. Harold was 63 and had driven Appalachian roads most of his life. He normally passed hitchhikers after dark without giving them much thought. That night, he stopped because the man was not trying to hitchhike. He was standing perfectly still and pointing down the road Harold had just traveled. Harold was returning home after spending several days with his older sister near the Kentucky and West Virginia border. He had driven the route many times, although usually during daylight. The highway crossed several ridges before narrowing into a 2-lane road that followed an isolated valley for nearly 30 miles. Old coal roads disappeared into the mountains on either side, and abandoned houses occasionally appeared beyond the trees. Cellular service came and went throughout the valley. Harold knew the road well enough that the isolation never bothered him. His only concern that evening was reaching home before exhaustion made driving difficult. Rain had passed through the area earlier, leaving the pavement dark and reflective beneath his headlights. Temperatures were falling quickly, and patches of fog had begun forming near the creek. Harold had not seen another vehicle for almost 15 minutes when he noticed the man beside the guardrail. The stranger appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s and wore a dark jacket over a lighter shirt. His clothing was wet around the shoulders. Instead of raising a thumb toward approaching traffic, he extended one arm toward the road behind Harold. His expression was difficult to see through the windshield, but his movements appeared urgent. Harold continued several hundred feet before slowing. Something about the situation suggested an accident. A vehicle might have left the road somewhere behind the curve, hidden below the embankment. He stopped on the shoulder and checked his mirrors. The stranger was already walking toward him. Harold kept the doors locked and lowered the passenger window only a few inches. The man reached the rear of the car, moved along the passenger side, and stopped near the window. Harold could see mud on his pants and a fresh scrape across one hand. The stranger did not ask for transportation into town. Through the narrow opening, he indicated that a vehicle had gone down the mountain and that someone might still be inside. Harold could not see anything from where he had stopped. The curve behind them disappeared into darkness, and the shoulder dropped steeply toward the creek. The stranger appeared exhausted and cold, which made the situation seem credible. Harold decided that driving back to look for the wreck was safer than allowing an unknown man into the car. He turned around at a gravel pullout while the stranger remained beside the road. Harold drove slowly in the opposite direction, watching the shoulder for damaged vegetation or broken guardrail. After less than half a mile, he noticed several fresh marks in the mud beside the pavement. His headlights illuminated flattened weeds descending toward the creek. There was no broken barrier because that section of road had no guardrail. Harold stopped but remained inside the car. He directed a flashlight down the embankment and saw something reflective among the trees approximately 60 feet below. It looked like part of a vehicle. His phone showed no service. Harold drove another mile before finding enough signal to contact emergency services. He reported a possible vehicle accident and gave the approximate location. The dispatcher advised him not to descend the embankment. Harold returned toward the crash site and parked where his hazard lights would be visible. He expected to find the stranger waiting near the road. The shoulder was empty. For several minutes, Harold assumed the man had climbed down toward the vehicle despite the danger. He searched the roadside with his flashlight but found no obvious footprints in the wet shoulder. The flattened vegetation leading toward the creek remained visible. He considered calling toward the wreck, but decided to wait for emergency personnel. Nearly 20 minutes passed before headlights finally appeared around the northern curve. A volunteer fire vehicle arrived first, followed several minutes later by a sheriff's deputy and an ambulance. Rescuers descended the slope and confirmed that an older sport utility vehicle had left the road and struck several trees near the creek. The vehicle had suffered significant damage. Its driver was still inside and alive, but badly injured. There were no passengers. After stabilizing him, rescuers began the difficult process of bringing him up the embankment. Harold remained near the road, expecting the hitchhiker to emerge from the darkness at any moment. Nobody did. The deputy eventually asked Harold how he had discovered the wreck. Harold explained that a man had been standing beside the road and had directed him back toward the location. The deputy immediately searched both sides of the highway. Firefighters checked the slope around the vehicle, while another responder walked several hundred yards along the shoulder. They found nobody. The injured driver was conscious enough to provide basic information, and rescuers confirmed that he had been traveling alone. Harold assumed the stranger had witnessed the accident and left before authorities arrived. That explanation made sense. Someone living nearby might have been walking along the road, seen the vehicle leave the pavement, and tried to find help. The deputy agreed that it was possible, although the nearest occupied residence was several miles away. Harold provided a description before continuing home shortly after 1 in the morning. By then, the encounter felt strange, but not frightening. A man had needed help, Harold had stopped, and an injured driver had been found because of it. The story would probably have ended there if Harold had not received a telephone call 2 days later. The deputy wanted to clarify several details about the person he had encountered. Search crews had returned to the crash site during daylight and found evidence suggesting the SUV had left the roadway sometime before Harold discovered it. They also searched for a path the stranger might have used to reach the highway. Nothing unusual was found, but investigators wanted to know exactly where Harold first saw him. Harold returned to the area the following weekend. In daylight, the road looked different from how he remembered it. The place where the stranger had been standing was farther from the crash than Harold had estimated, nearly 3/4 of a mile away. Dense forest covered one side of the highway, while a steep rock slope rose on the other. There were no houses, driveways, or trails. Anyone reaching that location from the wreck would have needed to climb the embankment and then walk along the road. That possibility remained reasonable until Harold noticed the mud. Rain had made the roadside soft on the night of the accident. Investigators had documented tracks left by rescuers around the crash location, and the injured driver's shoes had remained inside the vehicle. Yet no clear trail of footprints had been found between the wreck and the place where Harold encountered the stranger. The absence proved little because parts of the shoulder were gravel and pavement, but it left the deputy uncertain how the man had reached that spot without being noticed. Several weeks passed before Harold learned anything else. The injured driver survived and eventually returned home after hospitalization. According to information later shared with Harold, the man remembered losing control on the wet curve, but had little memory of the period immediately afterward. He believed he had been trapped for a significant amount of time before seeing emergency lights above the embankment. He did not remember anyone approaching the vehicle before rescuers arrived. Harold accepted that the unidentified man was probably another motorist who had stopped briefly and then left his vehicle somewhere out of sight. There were countless logging roads and pullouts throughout the mountains. A local resident might also have known a shortcut through the forest. Nothing required a mysterious explanation, and Harold had no interest in turning an unusual encounter into a ghost story. He eventually stopped thinking about it. Almost 2 years later, Harold traveled the same road again. It was late afternoon rather than night, and he decided to stop at a small convenience store near the southern end of the valley. While paying for coffee, he recognized a photograph pinned among old community notices near the register. The picture showed several volunteer firefighters standing beside an emergency vehicle. One of the men looked remarkably similar to the stranger Harold remembered from the roadside. Harold studied the photograph long enough for the store owner to notice his interest. The image had been taken many years earlier during a community fundraiser. The man Harold recognized had served with a local volunteer fire department and had worked accidents throughout the valley. There was nothing remarkable about that information. In a small Appalachian community, an experienced volunteer responder would have known the road well and might easily have been near the crash for reasons Harold never understood. Then Harold noticed the date printed beneath the photograph. It had been taken in 1997. The store owner explained that several people pictured there were no longer living in the area. The man Harold recognized had died years earlier. Harold initially assumed he was simply confusing two similar faces. The stranger he had encountered was wet, poorly illuminated, and visible for only a short time. Human memory was unreliable, especially after 2 years. He finished his coffee and left without mentioning the accident. The coincidence bothered him enough that he later searched local newspaper archives. The former firefighter had died in 2010 at the age of 52. Harold found an obituary containing a clearer photograph and again noticed the resemblance. More unsettling was where the man had lived. His home had once stood in the same valley where Harold encountered the hitchhiker. Still, resemblance was not identification. Harold knew that memories often changed after people discovered information that seemed to support them, so he deliberately avoided treating the photograph as evidence of anything. His curiosity led him instead toward the history of accidents along the highway. The curve where the SUV left the road had been considered dangerous for decades, particularly during rain. Several serious crashes had occurred there before guardrail improvements were made on neighboring sections. The former firefighter had responded to many of those accidents during his years with the department. Harold found nothing suggesting the man had died on that road or had any unusual connection with the specific curve. The simplest explanation remained that the stranger was an unknown living person who happened to resemble him. That explanation might have settled the matter permanently if another driver had not reported something similar in November of 2021. A 56-year-old woman traveling through the valley after visiting relatives noticed a man walking beside the highway shortly before midnight. Temperatures were near freezing, and the location was miles from the nearest occupied property. She slowed because the pedestrian appeared to be signaling toward the road ahead rather than asking for a ride. The woman did not stop. She continued around the next curve and discovered a pickup partially blocking the highway. Its driver had suffered a medical emergency and lost control before striking the rock wall. The woman contacted emergency services and remained inside her vehicle until responders arrived. The driver survived. When she later described the pedestrian, her account contained several details similar to Harold's description from 3 years earlier. The man appeared middle-aged, wore a dark jacket, and had been standing alone without a visible vehicle. Local authorities did not connect the two events officially. There was no reason to. Hitchhikers and pedestrians occasionally traveled the highway, and descriptions of middle-aged men wearing dark jackets were hardly distinctive. Harold learned about the incident through an acquaintance who still lived in the area. He initially suspected that the same unidentified local resident might have witnessed both emergencies. If so, the person seemed unusually fortunate at finding stranded motorists before anyone else. The second incident differed from Harold's experience in one important way. The woman had a dashboard camera. She reviewed the recording because she wanted to determine where she had first seen the pedestrian. The video clearly showed the road, guardrail, and surrounding trees as her headlights approached the location. A human figure appeared near the shoulder for several seconds, although darkness and motion prevented identification. The camera proved that she had not imagined seeing someone. It did not reveal who the person was. The footage was never treated as evidence of anything unusual. A pedestrian had been beside the road, nothing more. Yet the woman remembered another detail after reviewing it. Approximately 6 minutes before seeing the man, she had passed a small gravel pullout. No vehicles were parked there. She encountered no traffic traveling in either direction between that pullout and the disabled pickup. Whoever stood beside the highway had apparently reached an isolated section of road without a vehicle visible anywhere nearby. After hearing about the second encounter, Harold drove through the valley one final time during daylight. He wanted to see the road without the fear and uncertainty created by darkness. He stopped near the location where he had encountered the stranger in 2018 and walked a short section of shoulder. The forest was dense, but not impossible to cross. Old mining and logging routes existed throughout the mountains. A person familiar with them could emerge almost anywhere along the highway. That observation gave Harold the ordinary explanation he had been looking for. Before leaving, he noticed a small memorial marker several hundred yards farther north. It had nothing to do with the firefighter whose photograph he had found. The marker honored a young driver killed in an unrelated accident years earlier. Flowers had been placed beside it recently. The discovery reminded Harold how many families in Appalachian communities had connections to those roads. People walked them, worked along them, responded to accidents on them, and remembered where others had been lost. An unidentified local resident helping stranded drivers was far more plausible than anything supernatural. Harold kept that explanation and never claimed otherwise. What happened to him required no ghost, legend, or impossible event. A stranger stood beside a lonely mountain highway. He directed Harold toward an accident that could not be seen from where they met. Harold found an injured driver and summoned help. When he returned, the stranger had disappeared. Those were the only facts Harold could confidently defend. Everything discovered afterward was coincidence, memory, and unanswered questions. Yet one detail continued bothering him. During his original encounter, the stranger's clothing had been wet and muddy, especially around the lower legs. Harold had always assumed the man had climbed from the crash site near the creek. Searchers found no clear trail proving that journey, but it remained the most logical explanation. Years later, Harold learned that the creek had been unusually high that night because of the earlier rain. Rescuers had approached the SUV from above because crossing from downstream was considered unsafe. If the stranger had climbed from the wreck, he had somehow escaped the vehicle without being its driver or passenger. If he had approached from somewhere else, he had crossed miles of dark mountain terrain at exactly the right time to discover a crash hidden below the road. Then, after successfully stopping the only vehicle to pass for several minutes, he disappeared before emergency crews arrived and never contacted anyone to explain what he had witnessed. Harold no longer drives isolated Appalachian highways late at night unless necessary. It is not because he believes something supernatural waits beside them. His concern is much more practical. Those roads contain long stretches without houses, streetlights, or reliable cellular service, and anyone standing beside them after midnight is there for a reason a passing driver cannot immediately know. Most travelers continue past and never discover what that reason might be. But whenever Harold remembers the wet October night in 2018, he knows that continuing past would have changed someone else's life. A badly injured driver was hidden below the highway, invisible from passing traffic. Harold had no reason to stop until an unknown man pointed him back toward the curve. Whoever that stranger was, he knew exactly where Harold needed to look. The injured driver survived. The unidentified man was never found. Harold never saw him again, and the resemblance to the dead volunteer firefighter remained nothing more than an unsettling coincidence that could never be verified. Years passed, the highway was improved, and traffic gradually increased through parts of the valley. The story should have become easier to dismiss with time. For Harold, it never did. What stayed with him was not the photograph or the later report from another driver. It was the final image in his rearview mirror before he turned around that first night. The stranger had remained beside the guardrail, watching Harold drive back toward the hidden wreck. He had not attempted to follow. He had not asked for a ride, shelter, money, or even help for himself. He had only made certain that somebody stopped. And on a mountain road where almost nobody was traveling that night, Harold still cannot explain how the stranger knew someone was alive at the bottom of that embankment or why he was gone before anyone could ask him. In this news story, Most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another. Families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain backroads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. Fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence, leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The lights slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation. In this new story, there are countless quiet communities scattered throughout the mountains of West Virginia where life rarely changes from one season to the next. Neighbors know one another by name, local deputies recognize nearly every vehicle on the road, and unusual events become the subject of conversation almost immediately. Most incidents are explained within hours. A missing hiker is located. A broken-down vehicle is towed away. A suspicious noise turns out to be wildlife moving through the woods. Yet, every so often, an investigation begins with an ordinary emergency call before quietly evolving into something no one can fully explain. One of the most puzzling cases unfolded during the early autumn of 2020 in a small mountain community where several residents reported seeing the same unfamiliar visitor, despite investigators finding no evidence that anyone had ever been there. The community of Laurel Ridge consisted of fewer than 500 residents living along a narrow valley surrounded by dense hardwood forests. The only paved road entered from the south before ending several miles later at the base of state-owned woodland. Aside from hunters during the fall and hikers throughout the summer, very few strangers had reason to visit the area. Because unfamiliar vehicles were immediately noticed, the sheriff's office initially paid close attention when multiple residents reported seeing an older, dark-colored sedan driving slowly through the neighborhood over 3 consecutive evenings. The vehicle never exceeded the speed limit, never stopped at any residence, and never appeared on traffic cameras positioned at the highway entrance leading into town. The first report came from a retired postal worker shortly after sunset on September 19th. While watering flowers near the end of her driveway, she watched an unfamiliar sedan pass without headlights, despite daylight already fading behind the surrounding mountains. She remembered the vehicle because every side window appeared rolled completely down, even though temperatures had already fallen below 50 degrees. The driver never looked toward nearby homes and continued north until disappearing around a sharp bend. Believing someone had simply taken a wrong turn, she mentioned the observation to neighbors the following morning without giving it further thought. The following evening, two volunteer firefighters independently reported seeing what they believed was the same sedan while returning from a training exercise. They described the vehicle traveling unusually slowly toward the dead-end section of the valley where no public roads continued beyond a locked forestry gate. Curious, because they had never seen the car before, one firefighter turned around after reaching the station and drove back along the same route less than 4 minutes later. The roadway remained completely empty. No intersecting roads existed beyond the point where the vehicle had last been observed, and the locked forestry gate showed no indication that anyone had opened it. After the third report reached dispatch, deputies reviewed traffic camera recordings covering every highway leading into Laurel Ridge. Investigators expected to identify the sedan entering or leaving the community during one of the reported evenings. Instead, every recording showed only vehicles belonging to local residents whose movements could easily be verified. No dark-colored sedan matching witness descriptions appeared on any available camera during the relevant time periods. Detectives initially suspected inaccurate witness recollections until they realized every report described the same vehicle characteristics, the same direction of travel, and nearly the same time of evening, despite the witnesses having no opportunity to compare their observations beforehand. Determined to identify the vehicle, deputies increased patrols throughout the valley during the following weekend. Shortly before dusk on September 23rd, one patrol unit positioned near the southern entrance observed a sedan matching the witness descriptions traveling north toward town. The deputy immediately pulled onto the roadway and began following at a distance of less than 300 yards. According to the in-car video, the patrol vehicle maintained continuous visual contact while rounding two gradual curves before approaching a narrow covered bridge spanning Laurel Creek. The deputy crossed the bridge less than 10 seconds after the sedan disappeared from view. The roadway beyond remained completely empty for nearly a mile in every direction. No driveways, side roads, or hidden trails connected to the highway between the bridge and the point where the deputy stopped searching. Body camera footage confirmed the deputy's immediate reaction after losing sight of the vehicle. He exited the patrol unit expecting to find a disabled car concealed behind the bridge or along the tree line. Fresh rain earlier that afternoon had left soft mud bordering both shoulders of the highway. Tire impressions from the patrol vehicle were clearly visible, yet investigators found no additional tracks indicating another vehicle had left the pavement. Search teams examined nearby fields, creek banks, and abandoned logging roads before darkness made further searching unsafe. Nothing suggested that another vehicle had been present. The dashboard recording showed the deputy never reducing speed enough to allow the sedan significant opportunity to escape beyond the next curve. The sheriff requested assistance from the West Virginia State Police, who reconstructed the deputy's route using GPS data, video timestamps, and roadway measurements. Accident reconstruction specialists concluded that under normal driving conditions, the sedan should have remained visible for several additional seconds before reaching the next hill crest. Engineers considered whether changing light conditions, dense vegetation, or optical distortions caused by the covered bridge might briefly conceal another vehicle. Multiple test drives using identical speeds and vehicle positions failed to reproduce the disappearance documented by the patrol camera. Every reconstruction reached the same conclusion. The deputy had entered the bridge while the sedan remained ahead of him. Seconds later, the roadway beyond contained no vehicle at all. While investigators continued reviewing physical evidence, county historians uncovered several archived newspaper articles describing remarkably similar reports from the early 1970s. Residents had then complained about an unfamiliar sedan repeatedly driving through the same valley before apparently disappearing near the covered bridge. At the time, deputies concluded the reports probably involved motorists using little-known forestry roads that have since been permanently closed. Modern mapping, however, confirmed those routes had never connected directly to the highway section where the recent investigation occurred. Although the historical reports provided an unexpected parallel, detectives emphasized that they offered no explanation for the current case and should not be interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity. After nearly 4 months of investigation, the sheriff officially closed the file as an unresolved suspicious incident. No missing vehicle matching the descriptions was ever reported anywhere in West Virginia or neighboring states. No criminal offense could be identified, and no evidence suggested that witnesses had deliberately fabricated their statements. Investigators remain convinced that everyone involved had honestly described what they believed they had seen. Even today, retired deputies occasionally mention the Laurel Ridge investigation when discussing the most frustrating cases of their careers. Not because it involved violence or danger, but because it challenged one of the simplest assumptions every investigator relies upon. If several independent witnesses and a patrol officer all watch the same vehicle travel along a road with only one possible direction to go, common sense says it should eventually be found. In Laurel Ridge, it never was, and that unanswered question quietly remains one of the mountain community's enduring mysteries. In this new story, road trips through Appalachia can change quickly after sunset. A highway that feels ordinary during the afternoon can become almost unrecognizable once darkness settles between the mountains. Gas stations become farther apart, cell service disappears without warning, and a wrong turn can place travelers miles from the nearest town. Most frightening experiences on these roads eventually have ordinary explanations. But during the summer of 2022, two brothers traveling through eastern Tennessee encountered something investigators initially believed was an attempted roadside robbery. Within 48 hours, that explanation had fallen apart. What remained was a sequence of events captured partly on video, supported by physical evidence, and disturbing enough that neither brother has driven that route at night again. 49-year-old Andrew Keller and his younger brother Michael had spent 4 days traveling through Tennessee and western North Carolina, photographing historic railroad bridges and abandoned industrial sites. Both were experienced road travelers who had completed similar trips throughout the Appalachian region for nearly 15 years. On July 23rd, they left Johnson City shortly after 7 in the evening and planned to reach a motel near Knoxville before midnight. Their SUV had recently been serviced, the fuel tank was nearly full, and 2 navigation applications showed the same route. The brothers expected an uneventful drive lasting a little over 3 hours. For nearly half that distance, that was exactly what they got. Shortly after 9:30, construction signs redirected traffic away from their planned highway onto a narrow county road running south through heavily forested hills. The detour appeared legitimate. Reflective signs were positioned at several intersections, and another vehicle entered the same road less than a minute ahead of them. After approximately 12 miles, however, Andrew noticed they had not passed another construction sign. The sedan ahead had disappeared around a bend several minutes earlier, leaving the brothers alone. Their navigation systems continued directing them forward, indicating that the county road would reconnect with the highway in approximately 18 miles. Turning around seemed unnecessary, so they continued. The first unusual event occurred near an old concrete railway underpass. A pickup truck was parked sideways beyond the tunnel, blocking most of the roadway. Its headlights were off, but the driver's door stood open. Andrew slowed the SUV while Michael used his phone to record the scene through the windshield. Neither could see anyone near the truck. There were no hazard lights, emergency triangles, or signs of a collision. Enough space remained along the shoulder for their SUV to pass slowly, and Andrew began maneuvering around the pickup. At that moment, Michael noticed movement among the trees behind them. 3 people emerged separately from the darkness along the roadside. None carried flashlights, and none approached the abandoned pickup. Instead, they moved toward the SUV from behind while remaining several yards apart. Andrew immediately accelerated through the narrow opening beside the truck. The brothers later described the decision as instinctive rather than deliberate. Nothing had happened that clearly proved they were in danger, yet the arrangement felt wrong. Michael continued recording as the SUV cleared the obstruction. The final seconds of the video showed one of the unidentified individuals reaching the center of the roadway, while the other two remained near opposite shoulders. Andrew drove several miles before slowing. Neither brother wanted to return toward the underpass, so they continued following the navigation route toward the main highway. Approximately 10 minutes later, they encountered another obstacle. A large tree branch lay across both lanes. Unlike the pickup, the branch was small enough that two people could probably have moved it, but dense vegetation prevented driving around it. Michael checked cellular service and discovered both phones had lost connection. Their satellite navigation still showed the highway less than 9 miles ahead. With no safe alternative, the brothers remained inside the locked SUV while deciding whether to move the branch themselves. Before either man opened a door, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Andrew initially felt relieved, assuming another motorist had followed the detour. The approaching vehicle slowed roughly 100 yards behind them and stopped. Its headlights remained pointed directly toward the SUV. Nearly a minute passed without anyone approaching. Then the lights switched off. Michael began recording again. The darkness behind them became complete except for their red taillights, reflecting from roadside markers. Neither brother could determine whether the vehicle was still there. They waited another minute before Andrew made a decision that probably prevented the situation from becoming more dangerous. Instead of leaving the SUV, he carefully drove onto the shallow drainage shoulder and pushed through vegetation beside the fallen branch. Tree limbs scraped both sides of the vehicle, damaging paint and breaking the passenger mirror, but the SUV cleared the obstruction. Andrew accelerated immediately. Less than 30 seconds later, headlights reappeared behind them. The unknown vehicle had begun following. Michael's recording captured the lights remaining at a relatively constant distance through several curves. Whenever Andrew increased speed, the vehicle appeared to do the same. Whenever he slowed, approaching sharp turns, the distance between them decreased. For nearly 11 minutes, the brothers believed they were being deliberately followed through an unfamiliar mountain road. Then the headlights disappeared. There was no intersection, driveway, or visible place for another vehicle to turn. Andrew continued driving without stopping until they reached a small 24-hour gas station beside a state highway approximately 15 minutes later. Cell service returned almost immediately. The brothers contacted county dispatch and explained what had happened. A deputy met them at the station, examined the damage to the SUV, reviewed both phone recordings, and requested additional officers search the road. Investigators initially treated the incident as a possible attempted robbery involving a staged vehicle obstruction, a tactic occasionally reported in isolated areas. The physical circumstances appeared to support that possibility. Deputies reached the railway underpass less than 40 minutes later. The pickup truck was gone. Officers found fresh tire impressions on the gravel shoulder, but no abandoned vehicle, personal property, or people nearby. They continued toward the location where the brothers reported encountering the fallen branch. Nothing blocked the roadway. Investigators searched both shoulders, expecting to find broken vegetation where Andrew had driven around the obstruction. Instead, they found no fresh vehicle damage anywhere along that section. When Andrew returned with officers the following morning, he immediately recognized the underpass, but could not identify the location of the fallen branch, despite driving the road twice. The investigation became more confusing when transportation officials reviewed the alleged construction detour. No nighttime roadwork had been scheduled along the brothers' original highway, and the Tennessee Department of Transportation had authorized no detour directing motorists onto the county road. Maintenance crews searched the intersection where Andrew remembered seeing reflective construction signs. None were present. More importantly, fixed traffic cameras recorded the brothers' SUV leaving the highway at 9:37 p.m. Yet footage from the same camera showed no sedan turning onto the county road immediately ahead of them. The vehicle both brothers distinctly remembered following at the beginning of the detour never appeared in the recording. Detectives then examined Michael's phone videos. The first recording clearly showed the sideways pickup beneath the railway underpass. Investigators could also distinguish three human figures emerging near the road, although darkness prevented facial identification. The second video confirmed headlights following the SUV several miles later. Nothing in either recording indicated manipulation or editing. That evidence convinced investigators that at least part of the brothers' account had unquestionably occurred, yet attempts to identify the pickup failed. Its rear license plate appeared obscured by darkness, and no vehicle matching its general description was reported stolen or abandoned anywhere nearby. One final detail emerged when investigators compared the SUV's navigation history with the county road network. The GPS data showed the brothers leaving the highway normally and traveling toward the railway underpass. After passing beneath it, however, the recorded route became inconsistent. For approximately 23 minutes, location points placed the SUV intermittently on the county road and several hundred yards inside surrounding forest where no drivable routes existed. Technicians attributed the discrepancy to poor satellite reception beneath heavy tree cover. Even so, the total distance recorded by the vehicle's trip computer exceeded the mapped county road by almost 14 miles before the SUV reached the gas station. Investigators never determined where those additional miles had been driven. The case was eventually closed without arrests because detectives could identify no suspects and establish no specific criminal offense beyond a possible attempt to obstruct traffic. Andrew and Michael never claimed anything supernatural had happened. Both remained convinced that the people near the pickup probably intended to rob travelers, and that inaccurate GPS data made the later events appear stranger than they really were. Investigators considered that explanation reasonable. It accounted for the people, the truck, and possibly even the pursuing vehicle. What it never explained were the unauthorized construction signs, the missing sedan, the vanished road obstruction, or the additional mileage recorded during a journey that should have been considerably shorter. The brothers continued taking road trips together after that summer, but they changed one rule permanently. Whenever darkness approaches in the Appalachian Mountains, they remain on major highways regardless of what temporary signs or navigation applications suggest. Michael still keeps the original recordings stored on two separate drives, although he rarely watches them. The most disturbing moment is not the three figures emerging from the trees or the headlights following them through the mountains. It is the opening seconds of the first video. Just before Andrew reaches the abandoned pickup, the recording briefly captures the empty road behind them. There is no vehicle visible anywhere in the darkness. Less than 20 minutes later, something was following them from that same direction, and after years of reviewing the journey, neither brother has ever discovered where it came from. In this news story, most ghost stories are impossible to verify because they survive only through rumor, family tradition, or stories repeated over generations. Investigators rarely pay attention to those accounts because they usually contain little evidence beyond personal belief. Every so often, however, an incident emerges that attracts the attention of law enforcement, emergency responders, and independent witnesses at the same time. Those cases are remembered not because anyone proved the existence of ghosts, but because every documented fact resisted ordinary explanation. One of the most discussed incidents of that kind began during the autumn of 2016 inside an abandoned elementary school hidden among the hills of eastern Kentucky. What started as a routine trespassing complaint eventually became a case that local investigators still remember years later. The Red Hollow Elementary School had been closed for nearly 14 years after declining enrollment forced the district to consolidate several rural campuses. Since then, the building had remained empty while ownership slowly transferred between county agencies. Electricity, water, and heating systems had all been disconnected, leaving the school exposed to years of harsh Appalachian winters. Although occasional vandals broke windows or painted graffiti inside the gymnasium, deputies rarely considered the property a significant concern. The building sat nearly 2 miles from the nearest occupied home, hidden behind thick woods that discouraged casual visitors. Most local residents eventually forgot the school still existed until several unrelated reports began arriving within the same month. The first report came from two utility contractors inspecting damaged telephone lines after a powerful windstorm. While driving past the abandoned school shortly after sunrise, both men noticed lights glowing inside what had once been the second-floor library. Assuming renovation crews had entered the building without notifying the utility company, they continued their inspection before mentioning the observation to county dispatch later that afternoon. Records immediately confirmed that no maintenance work had been scheduled anywhere on the property. Deputies briefly inspected the exterior before finding every entrance secured with rusted chains, exactly as documented during the previous county inspection only 3 weeks earlier. Several nights later, the County Volunteer Fire Department received an emergency call reporting possible smoke coming from the school roof. Firefighters arrived expecting an electrical fire despite knowing the building had no active power service. Upon reaching the property, they discovered no flames, no smoke, and no heat anywhere inside the structure. Thermal imaging cameras detected only normal temperature differences caused by cooling, concrete, and broken windows exposed to the night air. Before leaving, however, one firefighter quietly mentioned noticing what appeared to be movement at the far end of an upstairs hallway while searching the building. Other crew members dismissed the observation as shifting flashlight reflections, and the incident received little additional attention. The investigation changed during the second week of October when a deputy sheriff conducting routine patrol noticed something unusual while driving along the county highway below the hillside. Through gaps in the trees, he briefly observed several classroom windows reflecting a warm yellow glow, unlike ordinary sunrise or vehicle headlights. Curious, after hearing earlier reports, he drove directly to the property. By the time he reached the parking lot, less than 4 minutes later, every window had returned to complete darkness. The deputy searched the entire building alone before requesting additional officers. Dust covered every classroom floor, fallen ceiling tiles blocked several hallways, and years of accumulated debris remained completely undisturbed. There was no indication that another person had entered the school. Because multiple independent witnesses had now reported similar observations, detectives requested permission to install surveillance equipment throughout the building. Motion-activated cameras monitored every exterior entrance, while additional units covered the central staircase, library, gymnasium, and second-floor hallway where unusual activity had reportedly been observed. Audio recorders capable of operating continuously for several weeks were also placed inside the building to capture any sounds occurring overnight. Investigators expected the equipment to identify trespassers within days. Instead, nearly a month of recordings produced an entirely different puzzle. No unauthorized person was ever recorded entering or leaving the school. Even so, dispatch continued receiving occasional reports describing lights visible inside upper classroom windows before dawn. When technicians reviewed the surveillance recordings, they found nothing unusual on the video itself. Hallways remained empty, classrooms stayed dark, and exterior cameras showed no activity beyond wildlife crossing the parking lot. The audio recordings, however, attracted immediate attention. On 5 separate nights, microphones placed inside different sections of the school simultaneously captured faint sounds resembling lockers closing somewhere along the second-floor corridor. The sounds lasted only a few seconds before complete silence returned. Structural engineers later analyzed the recordings, suggesting that cooling metal pipes, loose ventilation ducts, or settling roof supports might produce similar noises. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the remarkable consistency in timing and location across every recording. Seeking a practical explanation, investigators invited engineers specializing in abandoned structures to examine the school from foundation to roof. Every electrical conduit, maintenance tunnel, attic space, and basement storage room was carefully inspected. Specialists searched for hidden occupants, illegal electrical connections, battery-powered lighting, or evidence that someone had secretly lived inside the building. They discovered nothing beyond expected storm damage and years of gradual deterioration. Even the upstairs library, where witnesses consistently reported seeing lights, contained only empty shelves, broken furniture, and shattered windows overlooking the surrounding forest. No hidden equipment capable of producing the reported glow was ever found. As detectives expanded their investigation, county archives revealed something unexpected. Maintenance records from the early 1980s documented several complaints filed by evening custodians describing unexplained lights appearing inside empty classrooms after electrical circuits had been switched off during renovation work. At the time, supervisors concluded faulty wiring probably caused the reports, although electricians later found no defects requiring repair. The records contained only brief references and were forgotten for decades until investigators compared them with the current witness statements. Although separated by more than 30 years, both groups consistently identified the same section of the second floor overlooking the eastern hillside. The school remained under periodic observation throughout the winter, but reports gradually became less frequent before stopping altogether after the county approved demolition the following summer. Contractors dismantled the aging structure over several weeks while investigators remained on site, hoping demolition might expose concealed rooms, hidden access points, or forgotten electrical equipment overlooked during previous inspections. None was discovered. Once the final walls disappeared and the property was cleared, every report connected to the abandoned school came to an end. No similar observations have been documented there since. Today, the official investigation remains archived as an unresolved suspicious incident rather than a criminal case. Detectives involved have repeatedly emphasized that nothing uncovered during the inquiry proved the presence of ghosts or any other supernatural cause. Nevertheless, they also acknowledge that several important questions remain unanswered. Independent witnesses reported nearly identical observations without knowing one another. Emergency responders personally experienced unusual events while searching the building. Surveillance equipment failed to identify trespassers despite weeks of monitoring. Engineers eliminated every practical explanation they could reproduce. In the end, the case became memorable not because anyone proved a haunting had occurred, but because every reasonable explanation quietly disappeared long before the questions did. For those who worked the investigation, it remains one of the true ghost encounters that no one involved has ever completely forgotten. In this new story, there are certain summer memories that never seem to fade. People remember the sound of cicadas after sunset, screen doors closing behind them, and warm August air drifting through open bedroom windows. In small Appalachian communities, those memories often belong to a quieter America when families spent evenings on porches and children stayed outside until darkness covered the mountains. But for residents of one isolated community in southwestern Virginia, August of 2017 became associated with something entirely different. It began with children noticing someone standing beside an old country road after sunset. Within 2 weeks, adults had seen the same figure. By the end of the month, deputies were patrolling the valley every night. Nobody ever discovered who the stranger was, where he came from, or why he always appeared several miles closer to town each time someone saw him. The first report came from two teenage brothers riding bicycles home shortly before 9 o'clock on August 5th. Their family lived outside a community of fewer than 700 residents, surrounded by forest and abandoned farmland. The boys had spent the afternoon fishing at a creek several miles from home and were returning before complete darkness. About halfway through the journey, they noticed someone standing beside a weathered fence near an abandoned dairy farm. The figure appeared to be an older man wearing dark pants and a pale, long-sleeved shirt. He did not wave or attempt to stop them. He simply stood beside the road, facing the surrounding fields. The brothers continued riding and told their father after reaching home. He assumed they had seen a local farmer or someone checking property boundaries. The abandoned dairy farm still belonged to a family living several counties away, and hunters occasionally crossed the surrounding land. Nothing about the story seemed particularly unusual. 2 evenings later, however, an elderly woman living almost 2 miles south of the farm noticed someone matching the same description standing beside her mailbox shortly after sunset. She watched from her kitchen window, expecting the stranger to approach the house. Instead, he remained beside the road for several minutes before she briefly looked away. When she returned to the window, he was gone. The woman mentioned the incident to a neighbor who contacted the county sheriff because several isolated properties had recently experienced minor thefts. A deputy arrived before midnight and searched the roadside. The ground near the mailbox was dry and offered little opportunity for recovering footprints. Nothing appeared damaged, and the homeowner reported nothing missing. The deputy drove several miles in both directions without finding anyone walking along the road. With no evidence of criminal activity, the incident was recorded as a suspicious person report and quickly forgotten. 4 nights later, another sighting occurred. This time, a delivery driver traveling through the valley after completing a late route noticed a man standing beside a narrow bridge nearly 3 miles south of the original dairy farm. The driver slowed because the road had no pedestrian shoulder and worried the man might step into traffic. According to his later statement, the stranger remained completely motionless as the van approached. His clothing looked unusually formal for someone walking through rural countryside during a humid August night. The driver remembered a pale shirt buttoned to the collar and dark trousers extending almost to worn black shoes. No backpack, flashlight, or vehicle was visible nearby. After passing the bridge, the driver looked in his side mirror. The man remained standing in exactly the same place. Less than 15 minutes later, the driver stopped at a convenience store and mentioned the encounter to an employee. The clerk immediately asked whether the man had been wearing a white shirt. That question changed the situation. The employee had already heard about the previous reports from residents farther north. The driver contacted the sheriff's office before leaving the store, providing the first detailed description collected from someone unfamiliar with the local stories. Deputies began comparing the 3 sightings. None of the witnesses knew one another personally. Their descriptions were remarkably similar, yet one detail attracted more attention than the clothing. Each sighting occurred farther south along the same road. The first location was beside the abandoned dairy farm. The second occurred near the woman's mailbox. The third happened at the narrow bridge. When investigators plotted the locations, the unidentified man appeared to be moving steadily toward the center of the community, despite nobody ever seeing him walking between locations. Patrols increased during the following week. Deputies drove the road after sunset, while residents were encouraged to report anyone walking alone. Officers expected the mystery to end quickly. The stranger was probably a transient traveler, a local resident experiencing confusion, or someone deliberately frightening people. Every explanation required the same thing. Eventually, someone should see him moving from one place to another. Nobody did. On August 14th, a family returning from dinner encountered the figure approximately 1 mile beyond the bridge. Their dashboard camera was operating at the time. The recording later showed the family's vehicle traveling along an empty road before the headlights illuminated something near the right shoulder. For less than 3 seconds, a human-shaped figure appeared beside a utility pole. The image was blurred by motion and darkness, but investigators could distinguish light-colored clothing above darker legs. The driver slowed immediately. By the time the vehicle stopped and reversed approximately 100 feet, the roadside was empty. Deputies arrived 9 minutes later and searched the area using flashlights and a tracking dog. The dog briefly followed a scent from the utility pole toward an overgrown field before stopping near a collapsed stone wall. Beyond the wall stood nearly 40 acres of abandoned farmland surrounded by forest. Officers searched until after midnight without locating anyone. No fresh campsites, discarded food, clothing, or evidence of long-term occupation were discovered. The property owner confirmed nobody had permission to stay there. The dashboard recording was examined by investigators the following morning. It clearly documented something beside the road, but the resolution was too poor to identify a face or determine age. Detectives could not even establish whether the person captured in the video was the same individual described by earlier witnesses. What they could confirm was that someone or something roughly human in size had been present when the vehicle approached. For the first time, the strange reports were no longer based entirely on memory. News of the footage spread quietly through the community. Parents began collecting children before sunset. Evening walkers changed routes. Several residents installed inexpensive security cameras facing the road. Nothing openly dangerous had occurred, but the pattern itself made people uncomfortable. The stranger never approached anyone. He never asked for assistance. He never entered a yard while being watched. He simply appeared beside the road, remained there long enough to be noticed, and vanished before anyone could determine where he went. The next sighting occurred on August 18th, less than half a mile from the first cluster of occupied houses. A retired coal miner sitting on his porch noticed the stranger beneath a streetlight shortly after 10 o'clock. Unlike previous witnesses, he watched for several minutes without looking away. The man stood with his back partly toward the house, facing south toward town. The homeowner considered calling out, but decided against it. Instead, he went inside and contacted dispatch while continuing to watch through the front window. The dispatcher remained on the line while a patrol unit approached from the south. The homeowner could still see the stranger when the deputy reported being less than 1 minute away. Then a passing pickup briefly blocked the homeowner's view. The interruption lasted only several seconds. When the road became visible again, the man had disappeared. The deputy arrived almost immediately. The pickup driver was stopped several miles away and questioned. He remembered seeing the homeowner on his porch, but had noticed nobody standing beneath the streetlight. Investigators searched the area carefully. Behind the streetlight was an open field extending nearly 200 yards before reaching the forest. Anyone attempting to run from the road should have remained visible beneath the moonlit sky. The homeowner insisted nobody cross the field. Deputies found no person hiding nearby. Security footage from a residence farther south showed the responding patrol vehicle approaching the location, but captured no pedestrian leaving beforehand. By then, investigators had documented 5 sightings across 13 days. When plotted on a map, every location followed the same road south. The distance between sightings was decreasing. More importantly, the final location stood only a little over 1 mile from the center of town. Deputies did not publicly discuss that detail, but additional patrol units began remaining in the community overnight. For 6 nights, nothing happened. The absence of reports gradually reduced anxiety. Some residents believed the stranger had realized police were searching for him and left the area. Others suspected the entire sequence had involved several unrelated people whose appearances had become connected through rumor. Investigators considered that explanation increasingly likely. Similar clothing and poor nighttime visibility could easily cause witnesses to describe different individuals as the same person. Then came August 25th. Shortly before 11:30, the county emergency dispatcher received a call from the caretaker of a small church near the center of town. The caretaker had returned to retrieve paperwork left after an evening meeting. As he pulled into the parking lot, his headlights illuminated a man standing near the church cemetery. The description immediately matched the earlier reports. Pale long-sleeved shirt, dark trousers, no visible vehicle, no flashlight. The caretaker remained inside his locked truck and contacted dispatch. 2 deputies were already nearby and arrived in less than 4 minutes. The stranger remained visible for most of that time. According to the caretaker, he never moved toward the cemetery or the surrounding woods. He simply stood near the entrance facing the road. When the first patrol vehicle appeared around the corner, the caretaker glanced toward its flashing lights. When he looked back, the stranger was gone. Deputies immediately surrounded the cemetery. The property contained open grass bordered by a low stone wall and thick forest along its northern edge. Search dogs examined the entrance and several nearby graves, but failed to establish a usable trail. Officers remained until after 2 in the morning. Nothing suggested another person had recently crossed the cemetery. The caretaker's truck camera had captured part of the encounter, but the stranger stood outside the central field of view. Only a narrow, pale shape could be seen near the edge of several frames before disappearing. Investigators expected another sighting within days. None came. August ended quietly. September passed without another report. Patrols eventually returned to normal, and residents resumed evening routines. The unidentified stranger was never located, and no missing person matching his description was discovered in surrounding counties. No criminal activity could be connected to any of the sightings. With nothing further to investigate, the file was eventually closed. Years later, a local historian reviewing old property records discovered something that brought the story back into conversation. The road followed by the sightings had not always been a continuous highway. Before modern construction, it connected several farms with a railway depot that once stood near the center of town. Workers living in the Northern Valley commonly walked the route when traveling to the station. The depot had been demolished in the 1960s, but its former location could still be identified using historical maps. When the historian plotted the sightings against the old map, the progression ended less than 200 yards from where the railway platform had once stood. That coincidence fascinated residents, but proved nothing. Thousands of people had traveled the road during the decades when the station operated, and no record identified anyone matching the stranger. Investigators never treated the historical connection as evidence. Still, those who had seen the man found it difficult to ignore. The teenage brothers who witnessed the first appearance are adults now. The retired miner eventually moved away. The church caretaker stopped working nights years ago. None claims to have encountered a ghost. Most accept that an ordinary man probably walked through the valley that August and somehow avoided every attempt to locate him. But one question continues to follow the story. If the stranger was simply walking toward town, why did nobody ever see him walking? Every sighting placed him farther along the same route. Nobody saw him between those places. Nobody saw him arrive. Nobody saw him leave. He appeared beside the road after darkness, stood silently facing south, and vanished whenever attention shifted for only a few seconds. Then, after reaching the place where travelers once waited to leave the valley by train, he was never reported again. For the people who lived there, that is why those August nights remain difficult to forget. Nothing attacked them. Nothing chased their cars or entered their homes. The fear came from watching a pattern unfold slowly enough that everyone could see where it was heading while nobody could explain what was creating it. And years later, whenever longtime residents remember the warm nights of August 2017, some still remember the pale shirt beside the road and wonder where the stranger was trying to go. In this new story, every July, millions of Americans leave home believing the most dangerous part of their vacation will be heavy traffic, bad weather, or a flat tire somewhere along an unfamiliar highway. Most return with photographs, souvenirs, and stories they'll happily tell for years. Others return with experiences they rarely mention, not because no one would believe them, but because they still cannot explain what happened. Over the last 4 decades, sheriff departments, state police agencies, and local newspapers across the United States have quietly documented dozens of unusual reports connected to July road trips. None were ever officially linked together. Different states, different highways, different families. Yet investigators reviewing the records years later noticed something unsettling. Every witness insisted their trip changed forever after making one decision they believed was completely ordinary. The first case began during the second week of July 2015. Robert and Lisa Campbell had spent nearly 6 months planning a 2-week road trip from Missouri to Yellowstone National Park. Both were recently retired school teachers who preferred scenic back roads over busy interstates. Their travel journal, recovered months later by relatives, documented nearly every stop along the journey, including restaurants, fuel receipts, hiking trails, and conversations with local residents. It would eventually become one of the most detailed records investigators had available. On July 10th, shortly after leaving eastern Wyoming, the couple stopped at a small family-owned diner where another customer suggested a little-known scenic highway that crossed hundreds of miles of open prairie before reconnecting with the interstate farther north. According to him, the drive offered spectacular sunsets and almost no traffic. Robert marked the route inside his paper atlas before thanking the man. Security footage later confirmed the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one ever identified the traveler who recommended the road. The first 100 miles were exactly as promised. Endless grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, while the evening sun painted the horizon deep shades of orange and gold. Robert stopped several times to photograph abandoned barns, windmills, and grazing antelope. Lisa continued writing inside her travel journal, describing the highway as one of the quietest roads they had ever driven. Shortly before sunset, she noted something unusual. They had not passed another moving vehicle for nearly 40 minutes, despite traveling during the busiest vacation month of the year. Around 8:30, they reached a weathered service station standing alone beside the highway. Its fuel pumps had been removed years earlier, but the building itself appeared occupied. An elderly woman sweeping the front porch smiled and asked whether they were heading north. When Robert answered yes, she quietly suggested they continue driving until reaching the interstate without stopping again, regardless of what they might see along the road. Lisa later wrote the warning in her journal, adding that the woman refused to explain further before wishing them a safe trip. It seemed like an odd conversation, but neither considered it especially important at the time. Just after darkness settled across the prairie, Robert noticed headlights appearing several miles behind them. The vehicle never seemed to get closer, despite maintaining exactly the same speed for nearly 20 minutes. Whenever Robert slowed slightly, the distant headlights slowed as well. When he accelerated, they accelerated too. Curious, he eventually pulled onto the shoulder, expecting the other driver to pass. Instead, the headlights stopped almost half a mile away and remained perfectly still. After waiting several minutes, Robert returned to the highway. The distant lights resumed, following at exactly the same distance. They reached the interstate shortly before 10 and immediately noticed the headlights disappear. Relieved, they continued toward Billings without discussing the incident further. The following morning, while reviewing photographs from the previous evening, Lisa discovered something unexpected. One image, captured during sunset, clearly showed the highway stretching behind their vehicle for several miles. There were no headlights anywhere on the road. The timestamp matched the exact period when both insisted another vehicle had been following them. Photography specialists later confirmed the image showed no signs of digital alteration. The second case occurred 3 years later during July 2018 in northern Maine. Brothers Kevin and Thomas Riley planned a fishing trip near the Canadian border. Their route crossed long stretches of forest where gas stations became increasingly rare after sunset. Shortly after 9, they stopped at a lonely convenience store to buy coffee and ask about the quickest route to their rented cabin. The cashier looked toward the parking lot before asking whether they had seen an older green station wagon parked outside. Both brothers turned toward the windows. The parking lot contained only their pickup truck. When they answered no, the cashier quietly apologized and changed the subject. Less than an hour later, Kevin noticed an older green station wagon parked beside the highway with its hood raised. Assuming someone needed assistance, he slowed almost to a stop. Before either brother could open the doors, another pickup traveling in the opposite direction repeatedly flashed its headlights. The driver leaned out his window and shouted only 3 words, "Keep driving now." Kevin accelerated without hesitation. When they glanced back through the rear window, less than 30 seconds later, the station wagon had disappeared. The shoulder where it had been parked stretched empty beneath the moonlight. State police later confirmed no disabled vehicles were reported anywhere along that section of highway that evening. The final case came from southern West Virginia during July 2022. Emily Foster, a travel nurse from North Carolina, accepted a temporary assignment in Charleston and decided to spend several days exploring small Appalachian towns before beginning work. Unlike the previous witnesses, Emily carried a dashboard camera recording continuously throughout the trip. Shortly after entering an isolated mountain highway, she encountered a handwritten detour sign directing traffic away from ongoing bridge repairs. The route eventually led through a nearly abandoned coal community where every storefront appeared empty except one small grocery store still displaying fresh produce outside the entrance. Emily purchased bottled water, spoke briefly with the elderly owner, and continued driving. The receipt recovered from her wallet showed the purchase occurred at 4:23 that afternoon. 3 weeks later, curious about the unusual town, Emily attempted to revisit the grocery store while returning home. She never found it. Local residents insisted no grocery had operated there for nearly 15 years. Historical records later confirmed the building had been destroyed during a flood long before Emily claimed to have stopped there. Even more puzzling, the bottled water she purchased remained inside her vehicle, bearing the faded store label investigators could not match to any currently registered business in West Virginia. The receipt identified a tax registration number belonging to a company officially dissolved in 2016. No explanation accounted for how she obtained either item. Years later, a transportation researcher comparing unusual travel reports noticed an unexpected connection linking all 3 cases. None involved violence, none resulted in disappearances. Every traveler returned home safely, yet each witness received an unexplained warning from a stranger shortly before experiencing something investigators could never verify. The warnings differed only slightly. Keep driving, don't stop, stay on the highway, reach the interstate before dark. No official investigation ever determined why those warnings appeared so consistently across different states separated by thousands of miles. Perhaps they meant nothing at all. Or perhaps every July, somewhere along America's loneliest highways, ordinary travelers unknowingly pass through places where experienced locals understand one simple rule far better than any map ever could. In this new story, the Appalachian Mountains stretch for more than 2,000 miles across the eastern United States, passing through 14 states and thousands of small communities. Millions of people hike its trails every year without incident. Families camp beside its rivers, hunters disappear into its forests before sunrise, and retired couples spend quiet weekends driving its scenic roads. Yet, despite its popularity, there are stories that rarely appear in travel brochures or history books. They survive through sheriff reports, ranger journals, local newspapers, and conversations shared on front porches long after the sun goes down. Most of these stories are never presented as proof of anything supernatural. Instead, they are remembered because no investigation, no expert, and no witness has ever been able to explain exactly what happened. This is one of those stories. In the autumn of 2019, documentary photographer Aaron Mitchell accepted a commission from a regional history museum in North Carolina. His assignment was simple: spend 3 weeks traveling through the Appalachian Mountains, photographing abandoned schools, churches, railroad depots, and coal camps before time erased them completely. Aaron was 45 years old, meticulous, and unusually patient. He preferred working alone, often waiting hours for the right natural light before taking a single photograph. His reputation depended on accuracy, and he never embellished his experiences to make a story more interesting. Friends often joked that Aaron could spend an entire day documenting an empty building, without speaking to another person. That quiet personality made what happened during his assignment even more difficult to dismiss. His journey began without incident. During the first week, he photographed abandoned mining communities across southwest Virginia before crossing into eastern Tennessee. Every evening, he uploaded his photographs, backed up his equipment, and wrote detailed notes describing each location. Those journals would later become one of the most important parts of the investigation because they documented exactly where he traveled, who he interviewed, and what he experienced each day. Nothing unusual appeared until the afternoon of October 14th, when he stopped at a nearly forgotten mountain church outside a community that no longer appeared on most modern maps. The church had been built during the early 1900s and officially closed more than 20 years earlier after the congregation became too small to maintain the property. Local volunteers still cut the grass several times each summer, but the building remained locked except during occasional historical tours. Aaron spent nearly 2 hours photographing weathered wooden pews, stained glass windows, and handwritten hymn books left inside glass display cases. Before leaving, he met an elderly volunteer named Charles Morgan, who had cared for the property for more than 15 years. Their conversation focused mainly on local history until Charles unexpectedly asked whether Aaron planned to continue driving after sunset. Aaron answered that he hoped to reach another abandoned school nearly 40 miles away before spending the night in a nearby motel. Charles paused before quietly replying, "If you're still in the mountains after dark, don't follow lights that weren't there during the day." Aaron assumed the comment referred to hunters or private property and thanked the man before continuing east. By late afternoon, clouds settled across the ridges while temperatures dropped quickly. Shortly after 7, darkness covered the mountain roads completely. Traffic became almost non-existent, leaving Aaron alone with little more than the sound of tires against damp pavement. Around 8:15, while crossing a narrow ridge, he noticed a single light glowing through the trees several hundred yards above the highway. At first, he assumed it belonged to an isolated farmhouse. Less than a minute later, another light appeared farther along the same ridgeline. Then another. Within 5 minutes, 6 separate lights stretched across the mountainside. None moved, none flickered. They remained perfectly steady despite there being no visible roads or buildings nearby. Aaron stopped at a gravel turnout to photograph the unusual sight. Through the camera's viewfinder, the lights appeared unusually bright against the dark forest. He adjusted focus several times but could not identify their source. They looked too small to be houses and too steady to be flashlights. After taking several photographs, he climbed back into his vehicle and continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, he rounded another bend and saw the exact same line of lights again, now appearing on a different mountain entirely. He checked his navigation screen to confirm he had continued east without turning around. The map showed no intersections capable of returning him to the previous overlook. Yet the pattern of lights looked identical, right down to their spacing across the ridge. The following morning, Aaron reviewed the photographs over breakfast, expecting to identify distant cabins hidden by darkness. Instead, every image showed an empty mountainside. The trees, ridges, and night sky appeared exactly as he remembered, but the lights themselves were missing. Thinking the camera had malfunctioned, he compared the digital timestamps. They confirmed the photographs had been taken during the exact period he remembered stopping beside the highway. Even stranger, his handwritten journal contained a sketch of the lights drawn immediately afterward while the memory remained fresh. Aaron rarely sketched anything unless he believed it might help identify a location later. Rather than dismissing the incident, Aaron returned to the same overlook the following evening under nearly identical weather conditions. He waited almost 3 hours. The lights never appeared. During the drive back, he stopped at a small diner where several longtime residents gathered each night after work. Curious, he casually mentioned seeing unexplained lights on the mountain. The conversation around him stopped almost immediately. Finally, an older woman seated near the window asked him a question. "Were they all in a straight line?" Aaron nodded. Without another word, the the woman finished her coffee and quietly left the diner. No one laughed, no one offered an explanation. Instead, the owner walked over and changed the subject entirely, asking Aaron where he planned to travel next. Only after the other customers had gone did the owner explain why everyone became uncomfortable. Similar reports had circulated locally for generations. Hunters, utility workers, volunteer firefighters, and even state forestry employees occasionally described rows of steady lights appearing where no structures existed. Search teams sent to investigate never found electrical equipment, campsites, or evidence anyone had been on the ridges at all. Aaron spent the next several days researching county archives instead of photographing abandoned buildings. Inside a historical society office, he discovered newspaper clippings dating back to the 1950s describing unidentified mountain lights observed by unrelated witnesses across different decades. None of the reports claimed anything supernatural. Most suggested atmospheric conditions, distant vehicles, or optical illusions. Yet each investigation reached the same conclusion. No explanation fully matched the observations because the lights often appeared where roads had never existed. One forestry report even noted that helicopters flown over the reported locations during daylight found nothing but dense, untouched forest. When Aaron returned home, he organized the material into a presentation for the museum that had hired him. To the surprise of his colleagues, he removed every reference to the lights before the exhibit opened. Later, one curator asked why he excluded what seemed like the most interesting part of the assignment. Aaron's answer was simple. The photographs couldn't prove what I saw. The witnesses couldn't prove what they remembered. But none of us could explain it either. Years have passed since Aaron's journey through the Appalachians. The museum still displays his photographs of abandoned churches, forgotten schools, and empty coal towns. Visitors admire the images without realizing one chapter of the trip was intentionally left out. Somewhere among those mountains are ridges where experienced hunters refuse to chase distant lights after sunset, not because they believe every story they have heard, but because too many ordinary people with nothing to gain by inventing them, have described the same impossible sight for more than half a century. Perhaps there is a perfectly ordinary explanation waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps the Appalachian Mountains still keep a few stories that no one has ever been able to explain. In this new story, when investigators review emergency calls from the Appalachian Mountains, they quickly discover that the most unusual reports rarely involve violent crimes or major disasters. Instead, many begin with ordinary people describing something that simply did not make sense. A driver refuses to leave a vehicle after seeing someone standing beside an empty road. A family abandons a campsite before sunrise without taking their belongings. A veteran hunter suddenly turns around after spending decades walking the same trails. Most of those incidents are eventually explained through weather, wildlife, or simple misunderstanding. Others remain preserved inside county files because every practical explanation failed to account for the evidence. One such investigation began during the final week of July 2019 in a remote section of eastern Tennessee, where several unrelated travelers reported the same disturbing encounter after driving through the mountains long after dark. The reports all centered on Hollow Creek Road, a narrow two-lane highway winding through dense forest less than 15 miles from the Tennessee-North Carolina border. During daylight hours, the route was popular with hikers and anglers traveling toward nearby public lands. After sunset, however, traffic dropped dramatically. The road contained long stretches without homes, businesses, or reliable cellular service. Local deputies routinely patrolled the area because stranded motorists occasionally required assistance after hitting wildlife or suffering mechanical problems. Serious criminal activity remained rare, making the sudden increase in emergency calls during one particular week immediately stand out to investigators reviewing dispatch records. The first report came from a retired couple returning home after visiting relatives. Shortly before 11 o'clock, they contacted emergency dispatch after noticing a person standing beside the road near an abandoned wooden bridge. According to their statement, the individual appeared to be wearing dark clothing and remained completely still as their vehicle approached. Concerned that someone might have been injured or attempting to flag down passing traffic, the driver slowed to offer assistance. Before the vehicle reached the bridge, however, the figure disappeared behind the guardrail without crossing the road or entering the surrounding forest. Believing the person might have fallen down the steep embankment, the couple immediately contacted authorities. A deputy arrived less than 15 minutes later and searched both sides of the bridge using high-powered flashlights. Fresh rain earlier that evening had softened the muddy ground surrounding the roadside, creating excellent conditions for preserving footprints. Investigators found no tire tracks, footprints, or signs that anyone had recently climbed the embankment. The creek below remained shallow enough that an injured person could not have been carried away by the current. After completing a thorough search, the deputy concluded that the witnesses had probably mistaken a tree stump or roadside marker for a person while driving through darkness. The report was filed without further investigation. 2 nights later, dispatch received another call involving the exact same location. This time, the witness was an experienced commercial truck driver transporting livestock across the state. Unlike the previous callers, he carried a continuously recording dashboard camera. According to his report, he noticed what appeared to be a person standing beside the bridge long before reaching the location because the reflective stripes on the figure's clothing briefly caught his headlights. Expecting someone to wave for help, he reduced speed while preparing to stop. Instead, the figure remained motionless until the truck rounded the final curve. At that point, it disappeared from view. The driver immediately checked both side mirrors, expecting to see someone walking along the shoulder. The road behind him remained completely empty. Investigators obtained the dashboard camera footage, hoping it would identify the individual. The recording confirmed that the driver slowed significantly while approaching the bridge. It also showed a faint upright shape near the roadside, lasting only a fraction of a second before disappearing behind the truck's headlights. Image specialists enhanced the footage repeatedly, but could not determine whether the object represented a person, vegetation, or a brief lighting distortion caused by moisture on the camera lens. The video neither confirmed nor disproved the driver's statement, leaving detectives with evidence that raised more questions than answers. The investigation expanded after 3 additional motorists reported remarkably similar experiences during the following week. None of the witnesses knew one another, and each contacted emergency dispatch before local media became aware of the earlier reports. Every statement described the same section of Hollow Creek Road. Every witness believed they had seen someone standing beside the abandoned bridge. Every search conducted immediately afterward found nothing. Detectives carefully compared timelines, weather conditions, traffic volume, and witness backgrounds, expecting to identify a common factor linking the reports. The only consistent element remained the location itself. Rather than increasing routine patrols, the sheriff assigned 2 deputies to remain hidden near the bridge during several consecutive nights. Their objective was simple. If someone was deliberately frightening motorists, officers intended to intercept the individual before another emergency call occurred. The deputies positioned their vehicles well away from the highway and monitored the bridge using night vision equipment. Hours passed without incident. Shortly before midnight on the 3rd night, one deputy observed a vehicle suddenly slowing as it approached the bridge before accelerating away moments later. Dispatch immediately received another call from the driver reporting a person standing beside the roadway. The deputies reached the exact location in less than 40 seconds. Once again, nobody was there. Following that incident, engineers from the Tennessee Department of Transportation inspected the roadway, searching for reflective signs, damaged guardrails, unusual shadows, or roadside objects capable of creating the illusion of a standing person under certain lighting conditions. Surveyors mapped every tree, utility pole, and roadside marker visible from approaching vehicles. Computer simulations using identical vehicle headlights failed to recreate the appearance consistently described by witnesses. Although several combinations of shadows briefly resembled human shapes, none matched the reported height, position, or timing documented throughout the investigation. Detectives reluctantly ruled out the possibility that every witness had experienced the same optical illusion. As investigators reviewed older county archives, they discovered something unexpected. Nearly 23 years earlier, highway maintenance supervisors had submitted several reports describing motorists stopping along the same bridge after believing someone had been standing beside the road. Those reports contained no mention of ghost stories, local legends, or supernatural explanations. Instead, maintenance crews requested additional warning signs because drivers repeatedly braked unexpectedly while passing through the area after dark. The request was eventually denied after engineers failed to identify any roadway hazard requiring corrective action. The documents were quietly archived and forgotten until the current investigation brought them to light decades later. The sheriff officially closed the case after 6 weeks without identifying a suspect, uncovering evidence of criminal activity, or documenting additional reports. No missing persons were connected to the location, and no witnesses ever claimed the figure attempted to approach their vehicles or communicate with them. Detectives deliberately avoided labeling the incident as paranormal, concluding only that repeated witness observations could not be explained using the available evidence. Even today, Hollow Creek Road remains open to public traffic, carrying thousands of vehicles every year without incident. Yet, among local deputies who worked the investigation, one memory has endured. Every driver who reported the mysterious figure described the same reaction before contacting emergency dispatch. None believed they had encountered a ghost. Every one of them believed they had seen an ordinary person who desperately needed help. That simple assumption was exactly what brought them back to the bridge, and exactly what they could never explain. In this new story, in September of 2022, the West Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police hosted its annual investigative conference in Charleston. Among presentations covering homicide investigations, search and rescue operations, and digital forensics, one session attracted unusual attention despite involving no confirmed crime. The presentation examined a series of unexplained incidents reported over nearly 3 decades by residents of small mountain towns scattered across Appalachia. None of the cases resulted in arrests, none involved identifiable suspects, and none were officially classified as criminal investigations. What connected them was something far more unusual. In every case, experienced investigators concluded that the available evidence supported the witnesses' accounts far more than anyone had initially expected. The first file discussed during the conference originated in Clay County, West Virginia, during November 2016. Shortly after 6 o'clock on a cold Friday evening, the owner of a family-operated hardware store contacted local deputies after discovering the business unlocked despite having personally secured it less than an hour earlier. Nothing appeared to be missing. Cash remained inside the register, expensive power tools were untouched, and surveillance cameras continued recording normally throughout the evening. Deputies initially believed an employee had accidentally returned after closing. Instead, the surveillance footage showed the front door unlocking from the inside without anyone appearing on camera. Investigators reviewed the recording repeatedly, confirming there had been no interruption, digital corruption, or evidence of tampering. The door opened slowly, remained open for approximately 20 seconds, then closed again without a single person entering or leaving the building. Forensic technicians examined the property the following morning, expecting to identify a mechanical malfunction or signs of forced entry overlooked during the initial response. The electronic lock functioned perfectly during testing, fingerprints recovered from both door handles belonged exclusively to employees, and alarm records confirmed the security system had never been deactivated. More surprisingly, investigators determined that the locking mechanism could not physically disengage unless activated either from inside the building or through an authorized access code. The owner confirmed no employee possessed remote access, while security contractors verified that no system errors had been recorded that evening. The investigation concluded without identifying how the door had opened, leaving detectives with evidence that clearly documented the event but failed to explain it. The second investigation came from a small community in eastern Kentucky during August 2018 after volunteer firefighters responded to repeated reports of lights appearing inside a long-abandoned elementary school scheduled for demolition. Residents living nearby insisted the lights appeared only briefly before disappearing again, often after midnight when no authorized workers remained on the property. Responding firefighters entered the building expecting to find trespassers. Instead, they found every classroom empty, windows secured, and electrical service disconnected months earlier. Utility records later confirmed no power had reached the building since the previous winter. Investigators considered portable generators or battery-powered lighting, yet exhaustive searches recovered nothing capable of producing the illumination described by multiple witnesses over several consecutive nights. Unlike rumors that often circulate through small communities, the reports from the abandoned school came from individuals who had little connection to one another. Statements were collected independently from delivery drivers, overnight highway maintenance workers, neighboring homeowners, and a deputy sheriff patrolling the surrounding roads. Each described lights appearing behind second-floor classroom windows before disappearing moments later. Traffic cameras positioned several blocks away failed to capture the phenomenon because the building sat beyond their field of view, leaving investigators dependent upon witness testimony supported only by repeated, unsuccessful searches. After nearly 2 weeks, the reports stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and demolition crews removed the structure later that autumn without discovering evidence that anyone had been occupying the building. The final case examined during the conference began in a mountain town along the Virginia border during January 2020. County Emergency Dispatch received several calls reporting that church bells were ringing shortly after 3 o'clock on consecutive winter mornings, despite the church itself having been closed for nearly 6 months while undergoing structural repairs. Maintenance contractors confirmed that the bell tower's electrical controls had been disconnected during renovation work and remained inoperable throughout the project. Deputies responding to the church found locked entrances, undisturbed snow surrounding the building, and no indication that anyone had entered the property overnight. Audio specialists later inspected the bell mechanism, concluding that it could not have operated without electrical power or direct mechanical force. No evidence supporting either explanation was ever found. Investigators reviewing the 3 incidents several years later noted that each initially appeared simple enough to resolve within hours. An unlocked store suggested burglary. Lights inside an abandoned school suggested trespassing. Church bells ringing before dawn suggested vandalism. Yet, every investigation gradually moved away from those ordinary assumptions as physical evidence refused to support them. Surveillance systems functioned correctly, forensic examinations revealed no signs of criminal activity, and independent witness statements remained remarkably consistent throughout each inquiry. Rather than producing dramatic conclusions, investigators repeatedly found themselves eliminating one practical explanation after another until only the documented facts remained. During the conference discussion, veteran detectives emphasized an important distinction often overlooked by the public. None of the official case files described paranormal events, and none encouraged supernatural conclusions. Instead, the reports documented situations in which observable events occurred without leaving sufficient evidence to identify a conventional cause. Experienced investigators considered that distinction essential because unresolved cases demand caution rather than speculation. Even so, many acknowledged that these incidents remained memorable precisely because they resisted ordinary investigative methods despite careful documentation and extensive follow-up. Today, the three files remain archived within their respective county agencies, each carrying administrative classifications that simply identify the investigations as closed without resolution. The communities where the incidents occurred have largely returned to ordinary life, with new businesses replacing old storefronts, schools giving way to vacant lots, and church renovations long since completed. Yet among retired deputies, volunteer firefighters, and investigators who personally worked those cases, the stories continue to surface during conversations about the investigations that proved the most difficult to forget. Not because they revealed something supernatural, but because they demonstrated that even in the quietest Appalachian mountain towns, there are still cases where every available fact can be verified, every witness can be believed, and the truth can remain permanently out of reach. In this new story, few places attract curiosity like an abandoned house standing alone at the end of an overgrown road. To some, they are forgotten pieces of local history. To photographers, they are reminders of communities that slowly disappeared over time. To police officers and firefighters, they are simply dangerous structures waiting to collapse. Yet every so often, investigators respond to one of these forgotten homes, expecting to deal with trespassers or vandalism, only to discover a situation that refuses to follow ordinary logic. One of the most unsettling cases occurred during the spring of 2019 in a remote section of western Pennsylvania, where an abandoned Victorian farmhouse became the focus of an investigation that lasted nearly 2 months. Long after the property was demolished, those who entered the house agreed on one thing. They wished they had turned around before opening the front door. The farmhouse had been built in the early 1900s and overlooked what had once been a thriving coal community. By 2019, nearly every neighboring home had either collapsed or been removed, leaving the property isolated among acres of second-growth forest. County records showed the house had remained vacant for almost 18 years following the death of its final owner. Electricity, water, and natural gas had all been disconnected, while foreclosure proceedings left ownership tied up in legal disputes that prevented redevelopment. Aside from occasional inspections by county officials, nobody was supposed to enter the building. That changed after local hunters began reporting signs that someone was regularly occupying the upstairs rooms despite no vehicles ever being seen nearby. The reports initially seemed routine. Hunters described curtains moving behind broken windows, footsteps echoing across the second floor shortly before sunrise, and fresh tire tracks appearing on the muddy access road before vanishing several hundred yards from the property. Deputies assumed squatters had found a way inside and scheduled a daytime inspection. The search revealed no evidence of recent occupation. Dust covered every floor, bird nests filled several bedrooms, and rainwater had begun rotting portions of the roof. Kitchen cabinets remained empty, fireplaces contained years of accumulated debris, and no food, clothing, bedding, or personal belongings suggested anyone had spent even a single night inside. Investigators documented the property before leaving, convinced the complaints had been exaggerated. 3 evenings later, County Dispatch received another call, this time from a volunteer firefighter returning home after a training exercise. While passing the abandoned farmhouse, he noticed a faint orange glow coming from an upstairs bedroom overlooking the valley. Believing trespassers might have started a fire inside the deteriorating structure, he immediately contacted emergency services. Engine crews arrived within 12 minutes expecting flames or smoke. Instead, they found the building completely dark. Thermal imaging cameras detected no elevated temperatures anywhere inside the house, and firefighters found no evidence that a fire had recently burned. Yet, the responding lieutenant later confirmed that the upstairs window had clearly appeared illuminated while approaching the property from the road. Concerned that someone might be entering and leaving before responders arrived, detectives requested permission to install motion-activated cameras around the exterior. 4 cameras monitored every accessible entrance, while an additional unit overlooked the staircase leading to the 2nd floor. The surveillance system operated continuously for 21 days. During that time, it captured deer, coyotes, raccoons, wild turkeys, and countless smaller animals moving around the abandoned house. It never recorded a single person approaching the property. Nevertheless, dispatch continued receiving occasional reports from passing motorists describing lights in the upstairs bedroom during the early hours before dawn. Investigators eventually decided to remain inside the farmhouse overnight. Shortly before midnight, two detectives, a county fire investigator, and a structural engineer entered the building carrying battery-powered lighting, portable radios, and environmental monitoring equipment. Their objective was simple. If someone entered the property, they intended to observe exactly how access had been gained. The first several hours passed without incident. Wind moved through broken windows, loose floorboards creaked under changing temperatures, and wildlife occasionally rustled outside. Everything matched what the investigators expected from an abandoned structure that had stood empty for nearly 2 decades. At approximately 2:43 a.m., one detective noticed an unusual sound coming from the upper hallway. It was not loud enough to identify immediately, but everyone inside heard it at nearly the same moment. The sound resembled the slow movement of wooden furniture being dragged across an old floor. Believing someone had entered through an unseen opening, the investigators climbed the staircase together and searched every room one by one. Each bedroom remained exactly as documented during previous inspections. Layers of dust remained undisturbed, windows were locked from the inside, and no footprints appeared on the floor beyond those made by the investigators themselves. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun and never repeated during the remainder of the night. The following morning, technicians downloaded every surveillance recording collected during the overnight operation. The exterior cameras showed no activity around the house. The interior camera, aimed directly at the staircase, revealed the investigators ascending together after hearing the unexplained sound. Nothing unusual appeared before or after that moment. Audio analysis, however, detected the same scraping noise recorded simultaneously by 3 separate body cameras carried by investigators on the second floor. Because the sound originated on independent recording devices positioned in different rooms, forensic analysts concluded it had occurred within the building itself rather than through radio interference or equipment malfunction. Even so, no source could be identified. Several weeks later, engineers determined the deteriorating farmhouse posed an immediate safety risk and recommended demolition. Before heavy machinery arrived, investigators completed one final examination, hoping structural removal might reveal concealed rooms, hidden crawl spaces, or evidence of unauthorized occupation overlooked during earlier searches. They found nothing. Once the building had been reduced to its foundation, the county graded the site and removed the remaining debris. From that day forward, no additional reports of lights, footsteps, or unexplained activity were ever received from the location. The investigation officially closed without identifying trespassers, criminal activity, or a mechanical explanation for the repeated witness reports. Detectives involved in the case have consistently avoided describing the farmhouse as haunted, emphasizing that the evidence never supported such a conclusion. What they do acknowledge is far simpler. Independent witnesses repeatedly described the same upstairs room. Firefighters personally observed a light that left no physical trace. Investigators recorded an unexplained sound inside an otherwise empty structure, while every entrance remained under surveillance. None of those observations proved anything extraordinary, but together they created a case that resisted every ordinary explanation. Years later, among those who walked through the abandoned farmhouse, believing they were about to solve a simple trespassing complaint, the memory that remains strongest is not what they discovered inside. It is the lingering realization that they left with fewer answers than they had when they first stepped through the front door. Strange things happened on our June road trip after midnight. Deep in the remote stretches of the Texas Hill Country, a routine nocturnal drive became a completely unexplainable, terrifying nightmare. During the incredibly humid summer of 2022, young travelers encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What regional law enforcement eventually uncovered entirely completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific rural desert community forever. Archived notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunts state police today. 28-year-old David Miller worked as a dedicated corporate accountant, simply trying to relocate his small family safely. His capable traveling partner was a 26-year-old freelance photographer named Lisa, who actively documented rural historical landscapes. Their primary summer objective required them to drive safely across the desolate Texas wilderness, far away from heavily congested interstates. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unstable, dangerous sinkholes forming throughout that exact rural region. They arrived on June 14th and immediately began carefully plotting their specific nocturnal driving route near a dark limestone canyon. The first quiet, extremely hot evening passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted travelers drove steadily onward. State records confirm that severe, scattered desert thunderstorms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Lisa woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy scraping sounds echoing near the steep, dusty ridge. She initially assumed a curious, heavy desert animal was aggressively investigating their suddenly stalling vehicle near the rocky, jagged roadside. When she cautiously looked directly outside, the heavy metallic scraping sounds instantly ceased in the hot, oppressive summer nocturnal darkness. David quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive deep indentations in the dusty soil the following heavily foggy morning. The strange, unexplainable deep tracks were perfectly circular in shape, and they sank nearly 5 inches into the solid dirt. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial mining outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors. David carefully photographed the bizarre, dusty, massive footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a massive, heavy industrial machine. He calmly, rationally theorized that some unknown automated logging equipment might have dangerously crossed their remote territory completely unexpectedly overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark night when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. Both dedicated travelers immediately started coughing violently and aggressively, struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed heavy vehicle cabin. Lisa quickly grabbed her portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional ranger station during that month. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid asphalt ground and partially cracked their rigid windshield frame. David scrambled frantically out the dark open door and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera directly pointing upward. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous, intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a large dead oak tree. The strange glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient background radiation thermal signatures. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Morning light quickly, clearly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless, broken, jagged pieces. David frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining travel gear and hike toward the main rural highway. Lisa completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable magnetic headings. They were effectively hopelessly, completely lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced, rugged survivalists. The desperate, anxious travelers decided to blindly, consistently follow the slow, dusty trail, hoping it safely intersected a paved road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched closely behind. Archived notes from Lisa stated she repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly entirely nearby. Every single time she abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes instantly, completely vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced them to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the car. They huddled tightly, safely together by a small, warm fire while strongly clutching their sturdy walking sticks for necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense desert suddenly fell totally dead silent as wild insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their heavy boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Texas region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. David frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the expensive digital battery exploded. Lisa screamed out loudly in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly directly ahead. David slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly, heavily trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly extinguished the warm, bright campfire flames. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous, thorny desert. They hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually physically separated from each other completely forever. A commercial desert survey operator miraculously, happily found Lisa wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel public access channel. The young, traumatized photographer was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by sharp, jagged cactuses. State records confirm she was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly chemically treated properly. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned vehicle, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel car doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. David was tragically completely never seen again, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent dry counties. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the steep edge of rocky cliffs. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing accountant accidentally, fatally fell into the massive, dark, hidden sinkhole. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy vehicle equipment was completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Lisa completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising freelance rural photography career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, crowded city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark desert experiences. She eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark Texas hill country deserts remain mostly completely, thoroughly uncharted and deeply, heavily feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local rural tour operators actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from widely exploring that specific area. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual total highly accurate number of missing persons cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously completely venture into the dark region, hoping to finally capture definitive evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Lisa. The destroyed, shattered digital thermal camera conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant heat signature. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet, the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown massive desert animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying Texas desert case. The completely destroyed vehicle remains permanently locked securely inside a heavily guarded regional police evidence facility building completely indefinitely today. The thick steel chassis is completely severely warped and violently twisted in ways that heavily confuse professional, licensed structural engineers. They absolutely cannot logically, mathematically explain the immense localized heat signatures required to permanently warp such durable, thick commercial steel. The strange chemical residue carefully extracted from the melted doors completely lacks any known, recognizable, earthly, scientific, periodic table components. Law enforcement officials strongly, silently, actively discourage any independent laboratory scientists from officially testing the highly unusual toxic chemical samples. The specific isolated stretch of rural, unmarked desert highway remains completely officially closed to all civilian commercial traffic passing today. Heavy concrete barricades severely, completely restrict access to the dusty, dark path where the terrified couple originally became lost. Dispatch logs occasionally record highly unusual frantic phone calls from nearby rural ranchers complaining about strange bright nightly skylights. The massive glowing orbs reportedly silently hover directly above the completely restricted desert area before rapidly shooting straight vertically upward. Investigators never confirmed these extremely bizarre, localized aerial phenomena and simply quickly dismissed them as common military night training flares. Lisa constantly refuses to leave her highly secure concrete urban apartment whenever the hot summer season slowly, inevitably descends annually. She strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely, completely fastened throughout the entire long, dark night. She passionately, completely believes the towering, pale entities are still aggressively, constantly searching for her across the vast, expansive country. Her intense, ongoing, severe psychological therapy sessions carefully attempt to slowly, rationally dismantle her deeply ingrained, absolute paranoid mental delusions, the actual, absolute, terrifying truth hiding deep within that desolate Texas desert wilderness might never be completely, fully mathematically understood. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely safely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered. The county file from 2009 explicitly severely warns travelers to completely avoid driving completely alone during dark nights. State records clearly, consistently, actively document a highly disturbing pattern of unexplainable, strange disappearances occurring specifically during extremely hot Junes. The highly dedicated professional regional search teams completely, entirely refuse to officially patrol that specific dark sector after sunset arrives. What people continually reported seeing out there in the massive dark desert still completely, definitively, genuinely makes absolute zero sense. The completely bizarre, tragic Texas desert incident remains a highly popular, terrifying discussion topic on obscure internet online mystery forums. Amateur online sleuths constantly aggressively debate the various conflicting official reports while desperately searching for any hidden, logical, factual clues. Some highly dedicated researchers actively cross-reference these strange coordinate locations with deeply buried historical, indigenous, regional dark folklore stories. They firmly, completely believe the ancient native tribes genuinely knew exactly what terrifying entities lurked inside those specific dark canyons. However, local authorities absolutely strictly prohibit anyone from actively organizing dangerous, large-scale civilian search parties within that restricted region. The quiet, peaceful illusion of a totally harmless, relaxing summer road trip was completely, permanently shattered for that young family. Lisa completely isolated herself from all her remaining worried friends and slowly became a highly reclusive, paranoid urban apartment hermit. She constantly, frequently stares blankly out her heavily locked, reinforced apartment window while quietly listening for any heavy mechanical vibrations. Her completely tragic, deeply terrifying story serves as a highly dark, severe warning for any overly adventurous, naive young travelers. The absolute darkest, unseen, deepest corners of the harsh, remote American environment heavily conceal truly dangerous, unexplainable, ancient, predatory anomalies. In this new story, for most Americans, hitchhiking belongs to another era. During the 1960s, 70s, and even into the early 80s, it was common to see travelers standing beside rural highways, carrying backpacks, duffel bags, or cardboard signs listing their destinations. Today, the practice has nearly disappeared, replaced by smartphones, ride-sharing apps, and growing concerns about personal safety. Yet, across Appalachia, where isolated roads still connect hundreds of small communities, sheriff departments continue receiving occasional reports involving hitchhikers whose stories leave investigators with more questions than answers. Some reports involve stranded travelers. Others involve motorists who later insisted they picked up someone who seemed perfectly ordinary until the journey took an unexpected turn. The following case remains one of the strangest ever documented along the back roads of eastern Kentucky. During the final week of October 2017, 49-year-old Daniel Brooks left Pikeville, Kentucky, shortly after sunset following a routine maintenance inspection at a communications tower. Daniel had worked as a field technician for nearly 20 years and often drove remote mountain roads long after dark. Friends described him as practical, patient, and difficult to rattle. His truck contained emergency supplies, extra fuel, recovery equipment, and printed county maps in case his navigation system failed. He had traveled nearly every road in eastern Kentucky and believed there were very few surprises left in the Appalachian Mountains. Around 8:45 that evening, Daniel entered Kentucky Route 80 while taking a shortcut toward Prestonsburg. Traffic was unusually light. During nearly 30 minutes of driving, he encountered only two other vehicles. Autumn leaves covered the shoulders, while patches of low fog settled inside narrow valleys below the highway. The temperature had fallen into the upper 30s, making it unlikely anyone would be walking along such an isolated road. That assumption changed when Daniel rounded a sharp curve and saw a man standing beside an old wooden guardrail illuminated by his headlights. The stranger appeared to be in his late 60s. He wore a faded brown jacket, denim overalls, and carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder. He did not wave frantically or step into the roadway. Instead, he simply raised one hand as Daniel approached. Years working throughout rural Appalachia had taught Daniel that helping stranded travelers was still common in many mountain communities. He slowed, unlocked the passenger door, and asked where the man was headed. The stranger smiled politely before answering, just a little farther down the road. His voice was calm, almost reassuring, with the slow Appalachian accent Daniel had heard throughout his childhood. As they continued driving, the conversation remained surprisingly ordinary. The man introduced himself only as Walter and claimed he had been visiting relatives in a nearby hollow after attending a funeral earlier that afternoon. He spoke about abandoned coal camps, old churches disappearing from the mountains, and how many young people had moved away searching for work. Nothing about the discussion seemed unusual. Daniel later told investigators that Walter sounded exactly like dozens of older residents he had met during years working throughout eastern Kentucky. If anything, he seemed grateful simply to have someone willing to talk during a lonely drive through the mountains. After nearly 15 minutes, Walter pointed toward a narrow gravel road branching away from the highway. There were no reflective signs, no visible houses, and no mailbox identifying the road. Daniel slowed before asking whether anyone actually lived there. Walter quietly nodded and replied, "Used to be a whole community." The answer struck Daniel as oddly phrased. Before he could ask another question, Walter looked toward the dark forest beyond the windshield and added, "Most folks don't stop around here anymore, probably for the best." Daniel offered to drive him farther down the gravel road, but Walter immediately declined. Instead, he asked to be dropped off exactly where the pavement ended. Daniel stopped beside a rusted cattle gate partially hidden beneath vines. Walter thanked him, stepped from the truck, and walked slowly into the darkness carrying the same small canvas bag. Daniel watched through the side mirror until the man disappeared beyond the gate. Satisfied that his passenger had reached home safely, he continued toward Prestonsburg. Less than 5 minutes later, his truck radio suddenly filled with heavy static before clearing on its own. He thought little of it until reaching home later that evening. The following weekend, Daniel mentioned the encounter while working with another technician who had lived in the area his entire life. When he described dropping an older man named Walter near the abandoned gravel road, his coworker became unusually quiet. After several moments, he asked Daniel whether the man had been wearing brown overalls and carrying a faded canvas bag. Daniel answered yes without hesitation. His coworker then explained that the description matched Walter Hensley, a retired coal miner who had died from a heart attack nearly 12 years earlier. At first, Daniel laughed, assuming someone else shared the same name. His coworker insisted there had never been another Walter Hensley living in that hollow. Curiosity eventually led Daniel to the Floyd County Historical Society, where volunteers maintained newspaper archives and cemetery records. They located Walter Hensley's obituary from November 2005. The accompanying photograph showed an older man wearing denim overalls and smiling exactly as Daniel remembered. Even the canvas bag hanging from Walter's shoulder appeared in one family photograph donated decades earlier. According to surviving relatives, the abandoned gravel road once led to a small mining settlement completely abandoned after flooding during the early 1990s. Today, little remained except broken foundations hidden beneath the forest. No permanent residents had lived there for years. Daniel never claimed he had encountered anything supernatural. During interviews, he consistently stated that he believed he had given a ride to a real person. Someone with a normal voice, ordinary conversation, and detailed knowledge of the surrounding communities. Yet investigators could not explain how Walter disappeared so quickly after leaving the truck, why no other residents matched the description, or why Daniel accurately described personal details never mentioned until he later viewed the archived obituary. The sheriff's office found no evidence of criminal activity and officially closed the inquiry without further action. Stories like Daniel's continue circulating throughout Appalachia, often dismissed as misunderstandings, mistaken identity, or memories shaped by lonely mountain roads after dark. Most likely, there are perfectly reasonable explanations for every detail. Even so, experienced deputies, volunteer firefighters, and lifelong residents quietly share one piece of advice with newcomers exploring the back roads at night. If you decide to stop for a hitchhiker, pay close attention to where they ask you to let them out. Because sometimes the destination is no longer there, and sometimes the person thanking you for the ride has already been part of Appalachian history for many years. In this new story, the Carter family had lived in the same narrow Appalachian hollow for nearly 12 years before anything unusual ever happened. Their weathered farmhouse rested between steep forested ridges where sunlight disappeared long before evening reached nearby towns. Only 4 other homes stood within several miles, separated by winding gravel roads and dense hardwood forests that seemed to swallow every sound after sunset. The isolation had always been part of the appeal because the family preferred quiet lives away from crowded highways and expanding suburbs. Neighbors often described the hollow as peaceful, despite its reputation among older residents who quietly admitted they avoided walking those woods after dark. Spring arrived later than expected during that particular year. Cold mornings lingered well into April, leaving thick patches of fog trapped along the valley floor until midday. The Carter family continued their daily routines without noticing anything out of place. David worked maintenance at a nearby lumber mill, while his wife Karen managed the property and homeschooled their youngest daughter. Their older son often hunted turkey before sunrise, returning with stories about deer trails, black bears, and distant owls. Nothing in those conversations hinted that the family would soon become the subject of whispered discussions throughout neighboring communities. The first strange incident appeared so ordinary that nobody thought it deserved much attention. Shortly after midnight, one calm Tuesday, Karen woke because someone seemed to be slowly walking across the gravel driveway outside their bedroom window. The footsteps remained steady without rushing or hesitating. She assumed a neighbor needed help with a broken truck because emergencies sometimes happened in remote mountain communities. David pulled aside the curtain, expecting headlights or flashlights. Instead, he found only darkness stretching across the yard beneath a cloud-covered sky. The footsteps stopped the moment he looked outside, leaving complete silence behind. The following evening, everything remained perfectly normal until almost the exact same time. Again, the slow footsteps crossed the driveway. Again, they sounded close enough to identify individual stones shifting beneath heavy boots. David immediately stepped onto the porch carrying a flashlight. The beam reached the tree line without revealing anyone. Fresh dew covered the gravel, yet no footprints appeared anywhere across the driveway. The woods surrounding the farmhouse remained unusually still. Even insects seemed quieter than expected for that season, something David mentioned only after returning indoors. By the end of the week, every member of the family except the youngest daughter had heard the footsteps. Each person described the same deliberate pace. Nobody reported running, stumbling, or changing direction. Whatever produced the sound seemed to walk directly toward the front porch before stopping several feet short of the steps. Then, absolute silence followed. The family waited behind darkened windows several nights, hoping to catch whoever might be playing an elaborate prank. No figure ever appeared despite the unmistakable sound approaching the house with remarkable consistency. Weeks passed before another detail entered the story. Their closest neighbor, who lived almost 2 miles away, casually mentioned hearing someone walking outside his barn after midnight. He assumed raccoons had climbed across stored equipment until he noticed these sounds resembled measured human footsteps rather than animal movement. When David described similar experiences, the neighbor grew noticeably uncomfortable. He admitted older relatives once warned him never to investigate unexplained footsteps echoing through mountain hollows during unusually quiet nights. Those warnings came without explanations because previous generations rarely discussed such experiences openly. David dismissed the conversation as local folklore, even though the timing unsettled him. Rural Appalachian communities preserved countless stories passed through families for generations. Most involved cautionary tales meant to keep children away from abandoned mines, unstable cliffs, or unfamiliar strangers. He believed these newer rumors probably served the same purpose. Nevertheless, he installed brighter floodlights around the farmhouse and checked every window before sleeping. The lights illuminated nearly every corner of the property, making it difficult for anyone to approach unnoticed. Despite those changes, the footsteps continued exactly as before. Summer brought warmer temperatures and longer evenings. Friends visited for weekend cookouts, often staying well past sunset. Nothing unusual happened whenever guests remained outside. The strange sounds appeared only after everyone else had left and the family settled into bed. One visitor later remarked that the property felt unusually peaceful compared with neighboring valleys because almost no highway noise reached the hollow. Karen privately wondered whether that silence simply made ordinary nighttime sounds seem more disturbing. She tried convincing herself the explanation was psychological, yet every repeated incident chipped away at that confidence. One humid July night, the pattern unexpectedly changed. Instead of stopping near the porch, the footsteps slowly circled the entire farmhouse. Each family member listened while the unseen walker completed what sounded like a careful inspection around every exterior wall. Wooden boards occasionally creaked beneath invisible weight. Gravel shifted beside basement windows. Dry leaves rustled near the back entrance. David opened the rear door before the sounds reached that side of the house. Nothing stood beneath the floodlights except motionless trees swaying gently in the warm night air. Karen began recording dates and times inside a notebook. She hoped documenting each occurrence might reveal a logical pattern connected to weather, wildlife, or nearby activity. After several months, she noticed most incidents happened during calm evenings without strong wind or rain. The sounds almost never appeared during storms. They also seemed concentrated between midnight and 2 in the morning. Those observations fascinated David because they suggested consistency rather than random imagination. Still, neither explanation nor physical evidence emerged despite careful attention.